Negotiator, Dorset, September 1816. The introduction had been arranged by Lady Fenmore, which meant it had been arranged with the certainty of a woman who had already decided the outcome and considered the meeting itself a formality. The Duke of Brathwell needed a wife with capital. The Drace family had a daughter with more capital than most men in the north of England knew existed, and a reputation for being, as Lady Fenmore had put it with diplomatic precision, unusually capable. Lady Fenmore had not clarified what she meant by capable. She had not needed to. In the circles that mattered, the Drace name carried a specific kind of weight, the kind that came from building things that worked in places where nothing had worked before, and Eloin Drace had been her father's operational partner since she was 17. She arrived at Brathwell House on a Wednesday morning in the third week of September, accompanied by her father and the stillness of a woman who had learned very early that the quickest way to be underestimated was to speak first. She wore a dress the color of dark ink, well made, understated, the sort of thing that communicated wealth without requesting approval for it. Her father walked beside her with the unhurried confidence of a man who had entered grander rooms than this one and left them with signed contracts. They were shown to the morning room, which had tall windows facing south, and a view of the Dorset hills that would have been scenic if Eloin had not immediately noticed the water line on the lower slope, the discoloration in the grass that told her the drainage in the South Valley had been failing for at least 2 seasons. She noticed this the way she noticed everything. Automatically. Precisely. Without mentioning it. The Duke arrived at 10:30. He was younger than she had expected, and more deliberate, which was not the same thing as more careful. He entered the room with the posture of a man who had prepared his position in advance and was not expecting the conversation to require adjustment. His gaze settled on her with the complete evaluating attention of someone conducting an interview rather than making an acquaintance. "Miss Drace," he said. "Your Grace," she said. Her father and Lady Fenmore had arranged themselves near the window with the practiced transparency of 2 people who wished to appear uninvolved while remaining entirely present. The Duke glanced at this arrangement, and then at Eloin and said, with the economy of a man who did not enjoy social performance, "Shall we speak directly?" They were moved to the study. It was a working room, not a display room. She noted the maps on the far wall immediately, 3 of them, the Brathwell estate rendered in survey detail, with annotations in at least 2 different hands. She noted the ledgers on the desk, open, with figures that were not performing well. She noted all of this with the trained attention she brought to any room that contained information, and she said nothing about any of it. He sat behind the desk. She sat across from him. He regarded her with the evaluating expression and began. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries, Miss Drace. I am looking for a wife. My requirements are specific. I need a woman of sufficient fortune to address certain financial obligations of the estate. I need a woman who understands the expectations of a title and who will conduct herself within the boundaries of that position." He paused. "I need a woman who will leave the management of the estate and its affairs to those equipped for it." She heard the sentence beneath the sentence. She heard the careful construction of it, the way it had been assembled from something older and more painful than this conversation. "You have been married before," she said. Something shifted behind his expression. "Yes." "And your first wife involved herself in matters you considered outside her position." The pause was long enough to carry weight. "My first wife," he said, "had opinions about the running of this estate that exceeded her understanding of it. The results were not productive." Eloin studied the maps on the wall. She studied the open ledgers. She studied the man behind the desk who had walked into this room with a wound organized into a requirement and was now presenting the requirement as though it were reason. "You are telling me," she said, "that you want a wife who will not think. I am telling you That I want a wife who will leave the thinking to the men whose responsibility it is." She held his gaze. She held it for precisely long enough to communicate that she had understood not just what he had said, but everything he had not said, and that the distinction between the two was where the actual information lived. At that moment, the study door opened, and his steward entered with the hurried apology of a man interrupting something he knew he should not interrupt. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but Mr. Aldcott and the surveyor are asking about the South Channel, the flow calculations for the mill race. They cannot reconcile the figures with the fall of the land, and they are asking whether to proceed with the original specification or halt the work until—" "Tell them to halt," the Duke said. "I will review it this afternoon." The steward withdrew. The Duke returned his attention to Elowen as though the interruption had not occurred. But Elowen had turned her head toward the maps on the wall, specifically toward the third map, the one with the South Valley detail, where the mill race was drawn in blue ink and the gradient markings were, she could see from 8 feet away, wrong. She opened the leather notebook she carried in her left hand. She had carried it since she was 15. It contained calculations, observations, diagrams, solutions to problems she had encountered or anticipated or simply found interesting. She wrote in it now, quickly, 4 lines of figures and a single annotation, and then she tore the page out with the clean precision of someone who had done this many times before. She placed the page on his desk, face up, beside the open ledgers. "I believe that concludes our discussion, Your Grace," she said. She stood. She did not curtsy. She did not smile. She picked up her gloves from the arm of the chair and walked out of the study with the unhurried composure of a woman who had said everything that required saying and had left the rest on the desk in her own handwriting. She collected her father from the morning room. Lady Fenmore was mid-sentence about something involving the autumn social calendar, and stopped when she saw Elowen's face, which carried the settled resolve of a woman who had concluded her business and was not going to discuss it in the hallway. They were in the carriage before Lady Fenmore had fully registered what had happened. The Duke remained in his study. He stared at the door she had walked through. He stared at the torn page on his desk beside the ledgers. He had not yet read it. He would read it that evening. He would read it twice. He would take it to the South Channel the following morning and stand with his surveyor and his engineer and compare her 4 lines of figures to the calculations his men had spent 3 weeks failing to reconcile. Her figures would be correct. The annotation, a single sentence about the angle of the mill race relative to the natural fall of the valley, would resolve the problem entirely. He would fold the page and place it in the top drawer of his desk, and he would not mention it to anyone, and he would think about it considerably more than he intended to. Her father, who had spent 26 years studying his daughter the way other men studied markets, said nothing until the carriage had cleared the Brathwell gates and turned south onto the Dorset Road. "Well," he said. "He wants a fortune and a decoration," Elowen said. "He does not want a mind." Her father was quiet for a moment. "The man has had difficulties, Elowen. Lady Revere was—" "I know what Lady Revere was," she said. "I also know what I am. And I am not a remedy for someone else's regret." She gazed out the window at the Dorset hills passing in the September light, at the slopes she had read from the morning room window without saying a word, at the waterline she had identified in 3 seconds that his engineers had apparently been struggling with for months. "The Colborne Mill property," she said. "The listing came through Father's solicitor in August. The waterworks are failing, and the current owner has neither the capital nor the knowledge to restore them. The land is excellent, the water rights are exceptional, and the mill, if properly engineered, would serve every farm in the South Valley." Her father turned to her. "Colborne Mill sits on the southern boundary of the Brathwell estate. It is excellent property," she said. "The water rights alone justify the investment." Elewin, it is a commercial decision, Father. He regarded her with the quiet recognition of a man who had watched his daughter solve equations since she was 12 and negotiate contracts since she was 19 and buy her first property at 21, and who had a thorough understanding of what her commercial decisions looked like and what they didn't look like. He said nothing further. She watched the road ahead and thought about a study with maps on the wall that were wrong, and a man who had told her to leave the thinking to the men, and a torn page she had left on his desk that contained better thinking than his entire engineering team had produced in a month. And she almost believed that Colborne Mill was entirely about the water rights. Colborne Mill was purchased on the 14th of October, which was faster than most property transactions in Dorset, because Eloan Drace had her father's solicitors and her father's capital, and the focused determination of a woman who had decided something and saw no reason to wait for the world to catch up. The Duke of Brathwell was informed of the sale by his steward, who mentioned it during the Tuesday estate review with the studied casualness of a man delivering information he knew to be significant while pretending to consider it routine. "Miss Drace," the Duke said. He set down the account ledger. "Harlan Drace's daughter." "Yes, Your Grace. The sale completed last week. She has engaged a hydraulic engineer from Manchester and a surveyor from London. The surveyor arrived yesterday." The Duke's gaze moved to the window that faced south toward the boundary, where the Brathwell land met the Colborne property, where the mill sat idle in its failing water channel, and the South Valley spread out flat and quiet in the October light. "The torn page," he said. His steward waited. "The figures she left, on my desk, in September." He paused. "Have Aldcott confirm whether the South Channel work was completed to her specification or to ours." "To hers, Your Grace. Mr. Aldcott implemented her calculations the week after your meeting. The mill race has been flowing correctly since." The Duke said nothing for a moment. His attention returned to the south window. "She has purchased a mill," he said, "on my boundary. A mill whose water system connects to the same source that feeds the Brathwell South Channel." "Yes, Your Grace." "And she has brought her own engineer." "Yes, Your Grace." The estate review continued. The Duke did not glance south again, though his steward noted that his focus remained there long after his gaze had moved on. She was at Colborne Mill by the first week of November. The county found this unusual. November was not the season one took possession of a failing industrial property in rural Dorset. November was for London, for the late season, for the social obligations that kept a family's standing warm through winter. November in the country was for people whose standing was so secure it required no maintenance, or for people who did not care about standing at all. Elowan arrived on a Monday with 2 wagons of equipment, a housekeeper she had brought from the Drace house in Leeds, her hydraulic engineer, a foreman, and the leather notebook she had carried since she was 15. The county noticed all of this. Dorset was a county that noticed things, particularly when the things being noticed involved a young woman of considerable fortune, taking personal command of a waterworks restoration that most people in the valley had written off as a lost cause 3 years ago. She spent the first week learning the property. She walked every inch of the mill house, the sluice gates, the water channels, the failing dam at the head of the valley, and every acre of the surrounding land in the November cold, with the methodical attention of a woman conducting a complete engineering survey. The mill was structurally sound, but hydraulically ruined. The previous owner had neglected the water management for a decade, and the channels were silted, the dam was leaking, and the entire system needed to be rethought from the source down. She wrote 14 pages of notes in 4 days. She had a restoration plan drawn up by Friday. On Saturday morning, she walked to the northern boundary of the Colborne property and surveyed the water source that fed both her mill and the Brathwell South Channel, and thought about shared systems and upstream rights, and a man who had told her to leave the thinking to the men and whose estate was currently running on her calculations. She heard him before she saw him. The horse came along the ridge path from the Brathwell side on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of November, and she knew it was him because the pace was deliberate, not hurried, not casual. The pace of a man who had decided to come and wanted the decision to appear uncomplicated. She was standing at the water intake where the stream divided, one channel feeding south toward Colborne Mill and the other continuing east toward the Brathwell South Channel. She had her notebook open. She had been measuring flow rates for 3 days. She did not close the notebook when he arrived. He dismounted. He took in the scene, her standing beside the water with her notebook and her surveyor's marks on the stones and the bearing of a woman who had been working and did not intend to stop because someone had arrived on horseback. "Miss Drace," he said. "Your Grace," she said. He studied the stream. He studied the surveyor's marks. His gaze returned to the notebook she had not closed. "You are measuring the flow," he said. "I am. My engineer measured this flow in August. Your engineer measured the flow at the wrong point. The channel narrows 40 yards upstream and accelerates past the intake. If you measure here, you overestimate the available volume by roughly a third." He was quiet. She could see him processing this, could see him reconciling it with whatever figures Aldcott had provided, and she could see the moment he realized she was correct, because his expression did not change, but something behind it recalibrated. "You implemented my calculations," she said. It was not a question. "Aldcott implemented them. The mill race is running to my figures, not yours. It is running correctly. That was the objective." She almost smiled. Almost. Of course, the objective is all that matters, not whose thinking produced it. Their eyes met. The stream ran between the two channels, feeding both properties from the same source, and neither of them was talking about water anymore, though neither of them was prepared to say what they were actually talking about. "The water source is shared," he said. "Your restoration of the mill will affect the flow to my south channel. We will need to coordinate." "I agree. Write to me directly about it, not through solicitors, not through stewards." He paused. "I have found that your direct communication is efficient." She closed her notebook. She held it against her side with both hands, the way she held it when she was deciding something. "I left those figures for the men whose responsibility it was," she said. "I am glad they were put to use." He held her gaze for a moment longer than the sentence required, and then he mounted his horse and rode back along the ridge toward Brathwell House without saying anything further. She watched him go. She did not reopen the notebook until he had disappeared over the ridge line, and when she did, she turned to a fresh page and wrote nothing on it for a long time. The water dispute, when it arrived precisely the way Eowyn had known it would. The Colborne Mill restoration required a sustained increase in water flow through the mill channel during the working hours of the day. The Brathwell South Channel required consistent flow to feed the irrigation system that served the Duke's tenant farms in the lower valley. Both channels drew from the same stream, and the stream did not contain enough water to satisfy both demands simultaneously at full capacity. She wrote to him on the 23rd of November. The letter was 3 pages. It contained flow measurements taken at 7 points along the shared watercourse over a period of 11 days, a table of seasonal volume estimates based on rainfall records she had obtained from the county surveyor, and a proposed allocation schedule that divided the flow by time of day, with the mill taking priority during working hours and the South Channel receiving the full volume overnight and on Sundays. She rewrote the letter twice. The first version had been too conversational. The second had been too formal. The third was exactly what she intended, which was the precise communication of a woman who was aware that the line between professional correspondence and personal interest was thin enough to require careful management. His reply came 2 days later. It was in his own hand. This was notable because a duke did not typically write his own letters about water allocation to a neighboring landowner, and Alawen noted it in the way she noted everything, which was immediately and without comment. His letter disagreed with her allocation schedule. He argued that the tenant farms required morning irrigation during the growing season, that her proposed timing would leave his fields short during the critical hours after dawn, and that the historical use of the watercourse gave the Brathwell estate priority claim. He was not wrong about the historical claim. He was wrong about the morning irrigation being indispensable. She wrote back the same day. She proposed a meeting at the water source to review the figures together, and she included 2 pages of calculations that demonstrated the morning irrigation could be replaced by an evening schedule with no loss in yield if the channel gradient was adjusted by 4 inches over a distance of 60 yards, which would slow the evening flow enough to allow deep soil saturation overnight. He replied the following morning, 1 line in his own hand. Thursday, 10 o'clock, at the intake. They met at the water source on a Thursday that was cold enough to see breath and clear enough to read figures without straining. She arrived first. She brought her notebook, her surveyor's measurements, and a map she had drawn herself, showing the full water course from the source, spring, to both terminal points. He arrived on foot, which surprised her. He carried no documents. He considered her map, which she had spread on a flat stone beside the intake, and he considered it for a long time. "You drew this yourself," he said. "I survey my own properties. This is not merely a survey. This is a complete hydraulic analysis of a water system that spans 2 estates. It is a map," she said, "of the water, which we share." Their eyes met again. The wind came off the ridge and moved the corners of the paper, and neither of them moved to secure it, because they were both occupied with something that had nothing to do with cartography. "Your evening irrigation proposal," he said. "Aldcott reviewed it. And he believes it would work. He also believes the gradient adjustment is impractical without significant excavation. Your Mr. Aldcott is measuring the wrong section of the channel. The gradient change needs to happen at the bend below the ash trees, not at the field head. The natural slope does most of the work. The excavation required is less than 2 days of labor for 3 men." He traced the channel on her map, with his eyes from the source to the bend she had described, and she saw the moment he understood what she was proposing, because his expression shifted from assessment to something that was closer to recognition. "You have already identified the location," he said. "I walked it on Tuesday. On my land. On the shared watercourse, the boundary runs through the center of the channel at that point. I was on my half." Something that might have been amusement passed through his expression, though it did not quite arrive at his mouth. "Miss Drace," he said, "you are proposing that we abandon my historical allocation, adopt your untested schedule, modify my irrigation channel at a specific point you have already surveyed, on land you are claiming divided ownership of, and trust that your calculations are correct." "My calculations have been correct before, Your Grace." The sentence sat between them. They both knew what it referred to: the torn page, the mill race, the 4 lines of figures that had resolved in an afternoon what his men had failed to solve in 3 weeks. He considered the map. He considered the stream. He considered the woman standing beside the water with her notebook and her certainty and her complete unwillingness to pretend she was anything less than what she was. "I have a counter-proposal," he said. "We build a holding pond at the junction point. Here." He placed his finger on her map, at the exact location where the stream divided into the 2 channels. "We capture the excess winter flow and store it. During the growing season, both channels draw from the pond, rather than dividing the live stream. Your mill runs at full capacity. My farms receive full irrigation. Neither of us compromises. Elowen studied the point on the map where his finger rested. She ran the calculations in her head. The volume of winter excess, the required capacity of the pond, the engineering of the inlet and outlet. It would work. It was, in fact, elegant. It was the solution she had considered and dismissed as too cooperative for a man who had told her to leave the thinking to the men. That would require a joint construction project, she said, on the boundary. Yes, with shared costs and shared maintenance. Yes, that is not the position of a man defending historical priority. It is the position of a man who would rather solve the problem than win the argument. She held his gaze. He held hers. The stream ran past their feet, indifferent to the question of whose thinking had produced the better answer, because the better answer was the one they had arrived at together. And both of them knew it, and neither of them said it. She extended her hand. He took it. They shook once, firmly, the way two people shake hands when they have reached an agreement that means more than either of them is willing to name. I will have my engineer draw up the specifications, she said. Send them directly, he said. I have found that your direct communication is reliable. Efficient, she said. The word you used before was efficient. I have revised the word, he said. The neighborhood dinners began in December. Dorset in winter required them. The county was too rural and too small to survive the cold months without the structured gathering of its principal families. And so the dining rooms of the valley opened in rotation, once a week, and the same 30 people sat in different configurations around different tables and exchanged the same information in slightly different arrangements. Elowen attended all of them. She attended because Lady Fenmore told her attendance was required if she intended to be received as a permanent resident of the valley rather than a temporary curiosity, and because her father, who had returned to Leeds in late November, had written to say that social investment in a new territory was as important as financial investment, and she should treat the dinners as she treated site inspections. Thoroughly. She found that she was interesting to Dorset, not interesting in the way that a fashionable woman from London would have been interesting, but interesting in the way that an unexpected species is interesting to a naturalist. The men wanted to talk to her about the mill restoration, partly because they were curious, and partly because they could not quite believe a woman was directing it. The women wanted to assess her wardrobe, her manners, and her intentions regarding the Duke in that order. Lady Fenmore wanted to observe, which she did from whatever chair offered the best sightline to both Elowen and her nephew. Sir Edric Pavenham, who owned the largest farm in the South Valley, and who had been waiting for someone to restore Colborne Mill for longer than he was willing to admit publicly, asked Elowen about the water allocation over the roast beef at the Hambleton dinner in the second week of December. She explained the holding pond. She explained the engineering. She explained the seasonal flow analysis with the clarity and patience of someone accustomed to making technical information accessible to people who did not share her training. The Duke was at the far end of the table. He was listening. He was not watching her while he listened, which was the careful technique of a man who did not wish to be observed paying attention. But Lady Fenmore was studying him from 3 seats away, and Lady Fenmore missed nothing. At the Ashgrove dinner in January, Elowen found herself seated closer to the Duke, not adjacent, but close enough that their conversations crossed. He asked Sir Edric about the winter wheat. Elowen mentioned the soil drainage in the lower fields. The Duke turned to her when she said it, and the quality of his attention had changed. In September, it had been evaluating. In November, at the water source, it had been assessing. Now, it was something less managed, something that arrived at her face and stayed there one moment longer than the subject of soil drainage required. Lady Fenmore noted this. Lady Fenmore noted everything. He's not a man who watches women that way, Lady Fenmore said to Elowen after the January dinner, while they stood in the Ash Grove hallway waiting for the carriages. He has not watched anyone that way since Revere, and he watched Revere with fascination, which is a very different thing from what I am observing now. "And what are you observing?" Elowen said. "Respect," Lady Fenmore said, "which in my nephew's case is considerably more dangerous than fascination, because he doesn't know what to do with it." Elowen said nothing. She pulled on her gloves and gazed at the dark Dorset road and thought about a man whose attention had changed quality 3 times in 4 months, and who had revised the word efficient to reliable, and who had proposed building something together on a boundary that divided them. She thought about the holding pond, which was scheduled to begin construction in March. She thought about shared water and shared costs and the distinct danger of shared projects with men whose respect you had not anticipated receiving and were not entirely certain how to hold. February brought the cold, and the cold brought the problem. The holding pond construction had been scheduled for March, but the ground survey in February revealed an underground spring at the junction point that neither Elowen's surveyor nor the Duke's engineer had anticipated. The spring fed directly into the subsoil beneath the proposed pond site, which meant the excavation would flood before it could be lined, and the entire design would need to be reconsidered. She wrote to the Duke on a Tuesday evening. The letter was brief, 5 lines describing the spring, 2 sentences proposing alternative locations, and a request that he inspect the site before she made final recommendations. He arrived on Wednesday morning. Not a letter, not a steward, not Aldcott. The Duke himself on foot in the February cold, standing at the gate of Colborne Mill at 9 o'clock with mud on his boots and the resolved bearing of a man who had read a 5-line letter and decided that the appropriate response was his physical presence. They walked the site together. She showed him the spring. He studied the soil, the gradient, the relationship between the spring and the stream. She watched him think, which was something she had not previously had the opportunity to observe at length, and she found that he thought the way she did, methodically, spatially, turning the problem over in 3 dimensions before committing to a direction. "Move the pond 12 yards east," he said. "Use the spring as a secondary feed, rather than treating it as an obstacle. The natural flow supplements the stored volume." She opened her notebook. She turned to the page where she had sketched exactly the same solution the previous evening, and she held the notebook so he could see it. He studied the sketch. He studied her. "You had already reached the same conclusion. I wanted to see whether you would." The sentence was more honest than she had intended. It sat in the February air between them, and neither of them moved to qualify it or withdraw it. And after a moment he said, And you did," she said. They stood at the construction site in the cold, and the moment extended past the point where the engineering conversation would have naturally concluded, and into the territory where 2 people are standing together because they have not yet found a reason to stop. "Come inside," she said. "The mill house is warm, and I have tea, and you are standing in the mud." He came inside. He sat in the chair by the fire in the room she used as her office, the room with the maps on the wall, and the ledgers on the desk, and the notebook always within reach, and he surveyed it with the recognition of a man who understood the principles this room operated on, because it was organized the way his own study was organized, around work rather than decoration. They drank tea. They talked about the pond for 10 minutes, and then about the county road improvement for another 10, and then about her father's canal projects in the north, which led to a conversation about engineering principles that lasted 40 minutes and covered soil mechanics, water pressure, structural tolerances, and the satisfaction of solving a problem that other people had declared unsolvable. He mentioned a book on hydraulic engineering he had read the previous year. She had read the same book. They disagreed about the author's methodology in Chapter 7. The disagreement was specific and technical and entirely delightful. And when he left an hour and a half after arriving, they had not resolved it, and she suspected he had left it unresolved deliberately. She stood at the mill house door and watched him walk back toward Brathwell House along the ridge path, and she thought about a man who had told her to leave the thinking to the men, and who had just spent 90 minutes thinking alongside her as though it were the most natural arrangement in the world. The afternoon had been entirely practical. The afternoon had been entirely something else. March in Dorset was the month the valley remembered what water could do. The rains began on the 7th and did not stop for 9 days. The stream that fed both the Brathwell South Channel and the Colborne Mill swelled past its banks in the lower stretches, and the county watched the water levels, the way farming counties always watched water levels, with the careful attention of people who understood that their livelihoods depended on the difference between enough and too much. Elowen had been watching something else. She had been watching the old dam at the head of the valley, the one that predated both the Brathwell estate and the Colborne property by at least a century, the one that held back the upper reservoir and controlled the flow of water into the entire South Valley system. She had identified the weakness in November during her initial survey, a fracture in the western face, running diagonally from the waterline to a point 3 feet above the base, where the stonework had separated from the earthen core. In November, with low water, it had been a concern for future seasons. In March, with 9 days of continuous rain and the reservoir at capacity, it was something else entirely. She had mentioned the fracture to Aldcott in December. Aldcott had inspected it and concluded that the dam was sound. She had mentioned it again in February, in a letter to the Duke that was primarily about the holding pond construction, but included a paragraph about the dam assessment that was, in retrospect, more urgent than the rest of the letter. The Duke had forwarded her concern to Aldcott. Aldcott had repeated his assessment that the dam was sound. On the morning of the 16th of March, Elowen walked to the dam at first light and saw that the fracture had widened by 2 inches overnight. Water was seeping through the western face in a steady stream that had not been there the previous day. The earthen core behind the stonework was saturating. If the rain continued, and the forecasts from every farmer in the valley said it would, the western face would give way within 48 hours. The upper reservoir would empty into the South Valley in a volume and at a velocity that would destroy every farm, every channel, every structure between the dam and the lower road, including Colborne Mill and the Brathwell South Channel and the homes of 30 tenant families. She sent word to the Duke at 7 o'clock. She did not wait for his reply. By 8 o'clock, she had her foreman and her hydraulic engineer and 6 laborers from the mill restoration at the dam site. By 9 o'clock, she had assessed the failure point, calculated the load on the western face, and designed a temporary buttress using timber and stone from the mill stores. By noon, the buttress was in place, braced against the western face at the critical point, distributing the water pressure across a wider section of the dam wall. By 2 o'clock, she had cut an emergency overflow channel through the northern bank of the reservoir, a shallow trench that diverted the excess water away from the dam and into a natural gully that carried it safely past the valley floor. By 3 o'clock, the dam was stable. The overflow was functioning. The western face was holding. The Duke arrived at 3:30 with Aldcott and 4 men, and Sir Edric Pavenham and Lord Tavistoke, who had joined the party because Lord Tavistoke involved himself in anything that concerned the valley's infrastructure, which was another way of saying Lord Tavistoke involved himself in anything that might increase his influence over it. They rode up the valley path expecting a crisis. They found Elowen Drace standing beside the dam in a mud-covered dress, with her notebook in her hand, and the fracture buttressed, and the overflow running, and the valley safe. The Duke surveyed the buttress. He surveyed the overflow channel. He took in the engineering of both, the placement, the angles, the distribution of force. His gaze found Eloan. What crossed his face was not surprise. It was something more complicated than surprise, something that had recognition in it, and admiration, and the discomfort of a man confronting the visible evidence that the woman he had dismissed was the most capable person in the valley. Aldcott inspected the buttress. He inspected the overflow. He said nothing for a long time, and then said, "This will hold." "It will hold, because it was designed to hold," Eloan said. "The fracture has been visible since November. I reported it twice." Sir Edric Pavenham glanced from the dam to Eloan to the Duke, and said, "Well, it appears we were not needed." Lord Tavistoke did not share Sir Edric's grace about the matter. "Miss Drace," Lord Tavistoke said, with the careful enunciation of a man preparing a public position, "am I to understand that you personally directed this construction? That you brought laborers to a dam that serves the entire valley? That you cut an overflow channel through the reservoir bank without consulting the county surveyor or the landowners downstream?" "The dam was failing," Eloan said. "There was no time for consultation." "There is always time for proper procedure," Lord Tavistoke said. "There is always time to leave these matters to the men who are qualified to assess them. I do not question your intentions, Miss Drace, but I question whether a woman directing engineering work on infrastructure that serves 30 families is appropriate, regardless of the outcome." The sentence landed. It landed because it contained the Duke's words from September, rearranged and deployed by a man who did not know he was echoing them, but who had arrived at the same conclusion by a different and considerably less forgivable route. Leave it to the men. Leave the thinking to the men. The sentence was the same sentence, delivered by a man who had not spent 6 months watching Eloan Drace solve every problem he could not. The Duke spoke. "Lord Tavistoke," the Duke said, "the dam failure was identified by Miss Drace in November. She reported it to my engineer, who assessed it incorrectly. She reported it again in February. It was assessed incorrectly again. This morning, when the failure became imminent, Miss Drace designed and supervised a structural intervention that prevented the destruction of the South Valley, including your own tenanted land on the lower road. The overflow channel she cut will need to be made permanent, and I intend to commission her to design it, because she is the best qualified person in this county to do so." The sentence was precise. It was delivered without heat, without performance, without the self-conscious posture of a man defending a woman's honor. It was delivered as fact, organized into fact, with the complete authority of a man who had spent 6 months arriving at a conclusion he was no longer willing to leave unstated. Lord Tavistoke said nothing further. Sir Edric Pavenham regarded the Duke with the recalibrating attention of a man revising his understanding of a situation he had thought he understood. Lady Fenmore, who had not been present at the dam, but who heard the complete account from Sir Edric within 48 hours, received the information with the satisfaction of a woman whose arrangements were performing exactly as she had designed them. "He defended your work," Lady Fenmore said to Eloan 3 days later, over tea at the Fenmore house. "Not your person, not your reputation. Your work. Do you understand the distinction?" "I understand it," Eloan said. "He told Lord Tavistoke that you are the best qualified person in the county. Not the best qualified woman. The best qualified person. My nephew does not make statements of that kind unless he has examined the evidence thoroughly and is prepared to repeat them under any circumstances." "I know," Eloan said. "Do you also know that he has not publicly defended anyone since Revere, and that his defense of Revere was a defense of pride, not of competence, and that the difference between the two is the difference between a man protecting his own reputation and a man stating what he believes to be true?" Eloan considered her tea. She considered the window. She thought about a man standing beside a dam in the rain, saying she was the best qualified person in the county, with the voice of someone who had stopped performing and had simply said what he knew. He was right, Allowance said. The dam would have failed. Yes, Lady Fenmore said. And he knows that you were the one who prevented it. And he said so in front of Lord Tavistoke. And he will say so again to anyone who asks. And this, Elowen, is what it looks like when my nephew has made a decision about a person and is no longer interested in pretending he has not. She held Lady Fenmore's gaze for a moment. She thought about the difference between not needing someone to defend your work and being able to hear someone state the value of your work without it diminishing you. Those were not the same thing. She had spent her entire life believing they were, and she was beginning to understand that the distinction between them was where something important lived. He came to Colborne Mill on a Sunday morning, 5 days after the dam. 5 days was long enough to have thought about it, and short enough to mean the thinking had not required much deliberation. She was in the Millhouse office, at her desk, with the notebook open to a page of calculations for the permanent overflow channel the Duke had commissioned her to design. She heard his footsteps on the path before she heard the knock. He was on foot again. He knocked once. She opened the door. He was not wearing riding clothes. He was wearing the kind of clothes a man wears when he has walked a distance he could have ridden, because the walking was the point. Because the physical act of arriving on foot at someone's door communicates something that arriving on horseback does not. "Miss Drace," he said, "I owe you more than an apology, but I would like to begin with one." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." He came in. He stood in her office, in the room with the maps and the ledgers and the notebook on the desk, and he faced her with the bearing of a man who had organized what he needed to say and was going to say it without the protection of formality or the deflection of pleasantry. "In September," he said, "I sat behind my desk and told you to leave the thinking to the men. I presented this as a requirement for a wife. It was not a requirement. It was a wound I had organized into a policy, and I applied it to you as though you were the person who had caused the wound, which you were not. You were a woman I had never met, sitting in my study, reading my maps more accurately than my own engineer, and instead of recognizing what was in front of me, I made you answer for someone who was not in the room." Allowance sat down, not because she needed to, but because what he was saying required the kind of attention that was better given from stillness. "Lady Revere," she said. "Yes." "Tell me." He sat in the chair across from her desk, the same arrangement as September, reversed. She was behind the desk now. He was in the visitor's chair. Neither of them commented on this, but both of them felt it. "Revere was brilliant," he said. "She was more intelligent than I am. She was more intelligent than most people I have met. She involved herself in the estate because she could see what needed to be done and could not tolerate watching it done badly. She was right about most of it. She was right about the South Channel, which she identified as failing 6 years before Aldcott confirmed it. She was right about the tenant contracts, which she rewrote to terms that were fairer and more productive than anything my steward had proposed. And, Elowen said, and she was conducting a correspondence with my estate architect that was not entirely professional. And when I discovered it, the discovery was tangled with everything else, with her competence and her involvement and her presence in every part of the estate I had considered mine, and I could not separate the betrayal from the capability. I could not look at what she had done well without seeing what she had done to me. And so I made a policy. No wife of mine would involve herself in the running of the estate. No wife of mine would think her way into the machinery of my life. I would find a woman who would leave the thinking to the men, and I would never again confuse intelligence with loyalty." He stopped. He met her eyes. "And then you sat in my study," he said, "and you saw what was wrong with my maps in less time than it took me to finish my prepared speech. And you wrote 4 lines in a notebook and tore out the page and left it on my desk like a calling card. And you walked out of my house without curtsying. And I have not stopped thinking about that page, or that exit, or that notebook since September." Elowen was quiet for a long time. The mill house was silent except for the sound of water running through the restored channel outside the window, the channel that existed because she had engineered it, feeding a valley that was safe because she had reinforced a dam that his men had assessed incorrectly twice. "You were not seeing me," she said, "in September. You were seeing Revere. You were seeing a woman who thought too much and got too close and caused too much damage. And you were building a wall around your estate, and your life, and your judgment, and you called it a requirement, and you expected me to curtsy and accept it. Yes, I am not Revere," she said. "I am not a correction for Revere. I am not a safer version of a woman who hurt you. I am a different person entirely, and I am not interested in being managed by your history." "I know," he said. "Do you? Because 5 days ago Lord Tavistock stood beside your dam and said the same words you said to me in September, and the only difference between his version and yours was that you had 6 months to reconsider, and he had not." The sentence landed. It was the hardest thing she had said to him, harder than the torn page, harder than the correction at the water source, because it named the connection between his wound and Tavistock's prejudice, and made him see that the distance between the two was smaller than he wanted it to be. He did not flinch. He did not deflect. He sat in the chair in her office and received the sentence with the full weight it carried. "You are right," he said. "The distance was smaller than it should have been. The difference is that I have spent 6 months watching you solve every problem this valley has produced, and I have arrived at the conclusion that leaving the thinking to the men would be the most catastrophic policy decision this estate has ever made." She held his gaze. "You are the most unmanageable person I have encountered in 10 years, he said. "You buy property on my boundary. You measure my water at points I did not know existed. You survey my land on your half of the channel. You solve my mill race with 4 lines of figures. You reinforce my dam before I can get my boots on. You argue with me about Chapter 7 of a book on hydraulics that I was certain I understood better than anyone in the south of England." "You were wrong about Chapter 7, she said. "I was wrong about considerably more than Chapter 7. She considered the notebook on her desk. She considered the man in the chair. She thought about the torn page in September, and the held gaze in November, and the handshake at the water source, and the 90 minutes of tea and disagreement about hydraulic methodology, and the way he had said, "best qualified person," with the complete conviction of someone who was not performing a defense, but stating a fact. "I bought this mill because of you," she said. The sentence arrived in the room the way her torn page had arrived on his desk in September. Quietly. Precisely. With everything that mattered written on it. "I know," he said. "I have known since October. Your father's solicitor is not as discreet as your father believes, and the timing of the purchase was not difficult to interpret for a man who was already thinking about the woman who left 4 lines of correct figures on his desk and walked out of his house as though she had somewhere considerably better to be." "I did have somewhere better to be," she said. "You did," he said. "You had a mill to buy, and a water system to rebuild, and a dam to save, and an entire valley to prove wrong about what a woman with a notebook can accomplish. And you have accomplished all of it. And I am sitting in your office asking whether I am too late to deserve the page you left on my desk." She stood up. She walked around the desk. She stood in front of him, close enough that the distance between them was no longer the distance between neighbors or business partners or two people negotiating water rights, but the distance between two people who had spent 6 months building something neither of them had planned and both of them had wanted. She opened her notebook. She turned to a page near the back, a page she had written on a night in November when she could not sleep. And the mill house was quiet, and the Dorset dark was pressing against the windows. The page contained no figures, no calculations, no engineering. It contained a single sentence in her handwriting. He read the sentence. He met her eyes. "Since November," he said. "Since September," she said. "I wrote it in November. I knew it in September." He stood. He was taller than her, which she had known. But standing this close, the difference felt different. Not like imbalance, but like proximity. Like the closing of a distance that had been measured and surveyed and calculated, and was now, finally, being crossed. "You are not too late," she said. She said his name, not his title. Theron. It was the first time she had used it. It was the first time anyone in this county had heard her say it. And the sound of it in her voice changed the air in the room, the way a calculation changes when the final variable falls into place, and everything resolves. "You are not too late," she said again. "But you are going to have to tolerate the thinking." He put his hand on the side of her face. She put her hand on his arm. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It was not performed. It was the kiss of two people who had spent 6 months pretending that water rights and holding ponds and hydraulic disagreements were the substance of what was happening between them, and had finally, in a millhouse office surrounded by maps and calculations, stopped pretending. When he pulled back, she was still holding her notebook. He glanced at it. "That notebook," he said, "has caused me more difficulty than any document I have ever encountered, including my first wife's correspondence. It contains better engineering than your first wife's correspondence," she said. He almost laughed. Almost. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that was the closest thing to laughter she had seen from him, and she realized she wanted to see the full version, and that this was the kind of thought that belonged on the page she had written in November. "I am going to commission you to redesign the entire South Valley water system," he said. "The overflow channel, the holding pond, the irrigation, the mill, all of it. You are going to commission your future wife to redesign your estate infrastructure," she said. "I am going to ask the most capable person in the county to do the work that needs doing," he said. "The fact that she is also the woman I intend to marry is entirely relevant, and not at all beside the point." She closed the notebook. She held it against her chest. She held his gaze with the calm certainty of a woman who had walked into a study in September, carrying everything she was, and had been told to leave the thinking to the men, and had spent 6 months proving, without ever once arguing the point, that the thinking was the most valuable thing she had to offer, and that a man who could not see, that was not a man who deserved her. He could see it now. He had been seeing it since the torn page. He had simply needed 6 months, a boundary negotiation, a dam, a book disagreement, and a woman who would not stop being brilliant to admit that what he was seeing was the person he wanted to spend his life thinking alongside. The proposal, when it came on a Wednesday morning in the millhouse office, which was fitting because every significant development in their relationship had occurred either at a water source or in a room that contained her maps. He brought a document. This was so precisely characteristic of him that she laughed when he placed it on her desk, which was the first time she had laughed in his presence, and the sound of it surprised them both. "What is this?" she said. "A proposal," he said. "Proposals are typically verbal." "This one has specifications." She opened the document. It was a formal proposal for the joint management of the Brathwell estate and the Colborne Mill property as a single integrated water system, with shared governance, shared investment, and a management structure that placed her as the senior authority on all hydraulic and engineering decisions. It was, in form, a business proposal. It was, in substance, a marriage proposal disguised as a business proposal by a man who expressed his deepest commitments in the language of infrastructure. She read it. She read it twice. She met his eyes. "You are proposing a merger," she said. "I am proposing a marriage. The merger is a structural consequence. The governance clause gives me authority over all water management decisions. You are the most qualified person to make them. The governance clause reflects that. And the clause about shared investment. That is the marriage part." She considered the document. She considered the man. She extended her hand across the desk, and they shook on it, formally, the way they had shaken hands at the water source in November. And then she realized what they had done, and the laugh came again, small and genuine, and entirely unmanaged. And this time he did laugh. A real laugh, brief and startled and warm. The laugh of a man who had spent years managing every expression and had just been surprised out of his own discipline by a woman who shook hands on a marriage proposal. "I will need to inform my father," she said. "I have written to your father." "Already. I wrote to him last week, after the dam. You proposed to my father before you proposed to me. I requested his perspective on whether his daughter would consider a proposal from a man who had once told her to leave the thinking to the men and who had since revised that position comprehensively. And what was his perspective? He said that his daughter's thinking was the most valuable asset he had ever encountered in 30 years of engineering, and that any man who could not recognize that did not deserve access to it, and that if I had spent 6 months arriving at the same conclusion, then I was slower than he would have preferred, but not beyond recovery. She turned toward the window. She gazed at the Dorset hills beyond the mill. She thought about her father, who had educated her alongside his engineers and trusted her with his contracts, and never once suggested that her mind was anything other than the most important thing about her. "He will want to know one thing," she said. "Whether I am good enough for you." "Yes." "And your answer?" "My answer is that you are learning to be. And that learning is the part that matters, because a man who already believed he was good enough would not have walked to my door on a Sunday morning to apologize for a sentence he said in September." He regarded her with the depth of attention she had first recognized at the Ash Grove dinner in January. The attention Lady Fenmore had identified as respect, except that it had grown beyond January now. It had layers. It had the dam in it, and the torn page, and Chapter 7 of the hydraulics book, and the holding pond, and the underground spring they had both solved independently and simultaneously. "Your father also said," the Duke added, "that I should be aware that you will reorganize my entire estate within 6 months of the wedding, and that resistance is theoretically possible, but practically futile." "My father knows me well," she said. "I am beginning to," he said. Lady Fenmore received the news by letter, which she read aloud to Sir Edric Pavenham's wife at the Thursday morning call, with the controlled satisfaction of a woman whose most ambitious social engineering project had achieved exactly the outcome she had designed. "He proposed with a document," Lady Fenmore said. "A governance proposal with hydraulic specifications. I have never heard of anything more perfectly suited to both parties, and I take full credit for the introduction." She planned the engagement dinner immediately. She invited Lord Tavistoke because Lady Fenmore believed that social victories were best consolidated in person, and because having Tavistoke at the table where he was required to offer congratulations was, in Lady Fenmore's estimation, the most efficient use of an adversary she could devise. "She gets the efficiency from me," Lady Fenmore said to no one in particular. The engineering she gets from her father. But the efficiency is mine. The engagement dinner was held at the Fenmore House on the first Saturday in May. 38 guests. Alawen wore dark green, which she had been told suited her, and which she wore because she liked it, and had never required external validation to choose a color. She sat at the Duke's right. The table was arranged with the precision Lady Fenmore brought to all social occasions, which was the same precision Alawen brought to hydraulic surveys, and Alawen recognized this and appreciated it the way one professional appreciates another's methodology. The Duke leaned toward her before the first course and said, "Lady Fenmore has seated Tavistoke directly across from us." I noticed. "Are you prepared?" "I have been managing rooms since I was 16. I managed a dam failure in March. I believe I can manage Lord Tavistoke over soup." He considered her for a moment. "I have been reconsidering whether managed is the right word for what you do." "What word would you use?" "Commanded," he said. "Though I suspect you would find that too military." "I would find it accurate," she said, "in certain contexts." He held her gaze for a moment that was longer than dinner conversation required, and shorter than what he wanted, and she saw in his face the thing that Lady Fenmore had identified in January, and that had been accumulating since September. It was respect, yes. It had always been respect, from the moment she tore the page from her notebook in his study. But it had grown into something that included respect, the way a river includes its source, as the origin of something that had become considerably larger and more powerful than the point where it began. The holding pond, she noted with quiet satisfaction, had been completed in April, built to the revised design that incorporated the underground spring and was already filling with the season's runoff. Both channels were flowing. Both properties were served. The joint construction had been finished on time and under budget, which was what happened when the most capable engineer in the county was also the person managing the project. Lord Tavistoke offered his congratulations between the second and third courses. He offered them with the precise courtesy of a man who had no remaining position from which to object, and who understood that grace was the only strategic option available to him. "Miss Drace," he said, "I wish you every happiness." "Thank you, Lord Tavistoke," she said. "I appreciate your generosity, and I look forward to the permanent overflow channel serving your tenanted land as reliably as the temporary one has." It was a sentence that contained both a gracious acceptance and a factual reminder that his land was safe because of her engineering, and Lord Tavistoke received it with the composure of a man who understood exactly what had been communicated and had no adequate response. Sir Edric Pavenham raised his glass. "To the woman who saved the South Valley, and the man who had the sense to propose to her." With a document, Lady Fenmore added from the head of the table. The Duke turned to Alawen. Alawen took in the table, the 38 people who had come to acknowledge that she belonged here, not as a fortune or a decoration or a remedy for someone else's regret, but as a person whose thinking had earned her a place that no policy could have assigned and no prejudice could have prevented. She was not a woman who needed a man to validate her competence. She had built a mill. She had saved a dam. She had redesigned a water system. She had done these things before any proposal, before any declaration, before any man had stood beside her and stated her value publicly. But she was also a woman who could accept someone standing beside her and saying what he saw without it meaning she could not stand alone. She was a woman who could receive respect without it diminishing her independence. She was a woman who could allow someone to value her thinking without it meaning her thinking required someone else's permission to exist. Those were not the same thing. She had spent her whole life believing they were. The distinction between them was where the future lived. They were married in June, in the village church that sat on the road between the Brathwell estate and Colborne Mill, which seemed right because everything important between them had happened on the boundary between his land and hers. She wore dark green. He wore the face of a man who had prepared himself for a formal occasion and had been entirely undone by the sight of her walking toward him. Her father stood beside her and gave her away with the quiet conviction of a man who understood that the phrase was ceremonial rather than literal, because his daughter had never belonged to him in the sense that could be given. And the man she was marrying understood this, which was one of the reasons he deserved her. After the ceremony, in the garden of Brathwell House, where the reception had been arranged among the roses that Lady Fenmore had insisted upon, and the engineering diagrams that Elowen had insisted upon removing from the study walls for the occasion, the Duke found her standing at the edge of the south-facing terrace, looking down at the valley. From this vantage, you could see the full water system, the stream from the upper reservoir, the new overflow channel she had designed, the holding pond they had built together on the boundary, the two channels feeding south to the mill and east to the farms. The entire system, visible, functional, elegant, built by her thinking and sustained by his willingness to recognize it. "The torn page," he said. She turned to him. "In September," he said, "you wrote 4 lines in a notebook and tore out the page and placed it on my desk and walked out of my study. I did not read it until that evening. When I read it, I understood 2 things. The first was that your figures were correct. The second was that you had known they were correct before you wrote them, and you left them not because you expected me to use them, but because you could not sit in a room with a solvable problem and leave without solving it. It was not a gesture for my benefit. It was simply who you are." "Yes," she said. "And in November, at the water source, you opened your notebook and did not close it when I arrived. You were working. My arrival was not sufficient reason to stop. No. And in February, in the mill house, you turned your notebook toward me and showed me that you had already reached the same conclusion about the spring. You did not need me to solve it. You wanted to see whether I could. Yes. And in March, you took your notebook and your engineer and your foreman to the dam at first light, and you solved it before I arrived. Before anyone arrived. You did not wait for the men whose responsibility it was. You did not leave the thinking to anyone." "No," she said. "I did not." "And on Sunday, in your office, you opened your notebook to a page you had written in November. A page with no figures, no calculations, a single sentence. And you said my name." "Yes." He took her hand. He held it the way he had held it at the water source when they shook on the holding pond agreement, and then differently, the way a man holds the hand of the person he has married, not as a contract, but as a recognition. "I have spent 9 months watching you think," he said, "watching you calculate and survey and design and solve and argue about Chapter 7 and reinforce dams and tear pages out of a notebook that contains better engineering than anything my estate has produced in a generation. And I have arrived at the conclusion that leaving the thinking to the men would have been the greatest mistake of my life, because the thinking, Elowen, the thinking is the best part of you, and the best part of you is what I intend to spend the rest of my life standing beside." She held his gaze. She looked at the valley. She looked at the water system she had built, and the estate she was about to reorganize, and the man who had told her in September to leave the thinking to the men, and who had spent 9 months learning that the thinking was the thing he could not live without. She opened her notebook. She tore out a page. She handed it to him. It was blank. "What is this?" he said. "The first page of the rest of it," she said. "We will fill it in together." He took the page. He folded it and placed it in his jacket, the same way he had folded and placed the first torn page in the top drawer of his desk 9 months ago, except that this time he did it in front of her, and this time the page was not a solution she had left behind, but a future she was handing him. Lady Fenmore observed all of this from the rose garden, with the glass of champagne she had been holding for 20 minutes, without drinking from it, because she had been too occupied watching her nephew's face to remember the glass existed. He married an engineer, Lady Fenmore said to Sir Edric Pavenham's wife, which is exactly what I intended from the beginning, though I would not have phrased it that way at the time. The sun moved over the Dorset hills. The water ran through the channels Aloan had designed, from the reservoir through the overflow and the holding pond and the mill race and the irrigation channels, all of it flowing to the places it was needed because someone had done the thinking, and the thinking had been brilliant, and the man who had once dismissed it was now standing beside the woman who had produced it, holding a blank page. Beginning. Her father, who had driven down from Leeds for the wedding, and who had spent the ceremony watching his daughter with the pride of a man whose greatest investment had just matured beyond his most optimistic projections, said the only thing that needed saying. The best engineers, he said, are the ones who understand the structure better after they have built it than before they began. Aloan took the Duke's arm. She walked with him into the garden, into the house, into the life they were going to build together on the boundary between what he had been and what she had made him see. She carried her notebook in her left hand. She always would.